After some tweaks, I ended up with this. And so I'll give you a couple more tricks on how to actually line this up properly here in a minute, but I do want to focus on one thing before we get there, and that is expanding the body of these spikes. Right now, the velocity is blending in nicely for the areas that end up overlapping the spikes, but if we take a look at the guys on the left here, it doesn't really have enough body towards the end of its life. It's okay that these spikes are happening right here, they're kind of sharp. That does happen in reference, but we want to make it feel like a more full plume that's developing behind these spikes. And so the way that we're going to do this is by essentially spawning particles behind the trail as it goes through. And then once we have that, we'll take those particles, rasterize it, use it to create temperature and pressure. And that will create more of these sort of pyroclastic shapes in the actual spike simulation. So I know I'm going fast during these sections here, guys, but I want to show you what I did. This kind of stuff is starting to get more basic to what you've already seen. So what I have going on for the leading edge of the spikes is I've isolated this with the blast node by saying that if red is less than 0.5, go ahead and delete the points. So that brought us from here to here. I only want to spawn this in the leading edge areas. Now, inside the pop net here, we have a pop source. I've set this to about 40,000 points per second. All I do to get that point to lag behind is inherit less of the velocity. So in this case, I have 0.75. I also set this to a low life expectancy. I want these points gone quickly. And we have a little bit of a pop force to add some additional randomness and noise to the whole thing. So that's really about it. We grab those particles right here, we clean them up, and then we add in fuel and p-scale so that we're good to go for rasterization. That combines with the temperature here. With Axiom, you need the temperature and the fuel in order to get combustion. And so that all goes into the rasterize, and let's go ahead and cache this out to see what happens. And after many adjustments, I end up with this. So the overall setup is what I just described, but do keep in mind that one reason why I didn't go node by node for this particular situation is because this whole task probably takes a day worth of trial and error in trying to get the animation perfect, in trying to get the right amount of velocity sourced in, trying to get those particles just right. It's a very, very delicate balance. And so if you're having a hard time lining this up, my recommendation is to go from top to bottom. Start at the top where the spikes are at and overlay that with the original plume. Ask yourself, does the animation of everything make sense with every single step of the way? And then don't move on until everything is dialed in as well as it can be for that node. So what I mean is that before you simulate this stuff, check it out on the Pyro Trail SOP first. Get that looking as good as possible, and then move on to everything else afterwards. I do want to show you what I did, however. Just a few tricks here and there. So one thing that'll help this feel a lot more realistic is to adjust the start frame. I have this minimum and a plus range length. So it'll take the original start frame plus, in this case, 12 randomly for every single spike. That will add a lot of interesting detail in the animation. We can actually see that here in the reference, that some of these spikes are actually fairly delayed as to when they show up on the scene. And so you want to add a little bit of that delay. That helps quite a bit. Also, this start spread angle, I set this to 20, which prevents us from shooting straight up in the air. What happens when you go straight up is that it'll create a huge plume that will just go vertically up in the air, and it looks like temperature is being affected right there. So I do want the spikes generally going more so towards the sides, and so I do recommend setting that to 20. And let's see what else is going on here. Also, I want to show you what it looks like when I overlay the original plume with one of these trail paths here. So if I go right there, This gives you guys a visual sense on what's happening. I am overshooting a little bit. That's okay because the density fades off over time. But if you highlight this node, I believe, you can see where those arrows are going right there. And sometimes with the right combination of things highlighted, you can actually see the arrows overlaid with the smoke plume right here. So I forget how I did that, but I figured this out at one point here. And that's really helpful when trying to determine the overall animation and where these guys are at. So we could see the little brown arrows right there. And well, like I said, that just helps when you're trying to look at this plume and figure out where everything is going as far as the animation is concerned. So that's really the main way you want to dictate your animation. Also, I added a bit of temperature to the particles as well that were trailing behind. And I haven't even showed you my axiom settings yet. Let me show you what's going on here. So I have 3 substeps, division size of 0.05. That's the same thing that we had with our main plume. And for the sourcing, I did 10 on the density. That's the same thing as the main plume. Everything else is at 1 right here. And I set the mode here to blend, which with the axiom solver blends the original simulation velocity with whatever the velocity is in the actual pyro simulation that axiom right here is making. So again, we have that velocity that came in from the major plume, right? That blends in the velocity right here. I'm mostly blending in that velocity so that it follows what the main plume did. And so that's what's happening right there. If you go down, I keyframed this influence velocity so that we start at a value of 25, something pretty intense, and then that goes down to a value of 5 as we go through. This particular velocity is probably the main thing that's going to be pushing the cloudy shapes as the spikes progress. We can see that the velocity is delayed a little bit, but it pushes towards the direction of the spikes. And so that is really the main thing that's creating these cloudy shapes right here. We still do have combustion, and that adds a bit of vertical motion to the whole thing as well. However, the main body comes from this velocity here in the influence field. So do keep that in mind. In the simulation tab, I have the dissipation at 0.1, and I have just basic microsolver settings going on. Nothing fancy right here for the disturbance and turbulence and all that kind of stuff. I did match the wind direction to the main plume wind direction, however, so do watch out for that. And in the combustion, I basically ignite everything immediately. The density is 10, the temperature is 5, and I don't recommend a whole lot of pressure because that makes everything super bubbly. And so you don't want that bubbly looking spike that looks pretty ugly, but a little bit is nice because again, that adds body to the overall plume. So that ended up being the magical combination. Again, I spent all day trying to dial this in, and you'll have to do the same as well if you're doing this in production. But that gives you guys an overall taste of how to make these spikes integrate effectively. The nice thing about having this separate, even though it is kind of a pain, is that if the client wants changes, you now have this as a separate element. So depending on your deadlines, depending on the project, doing it this way may or may not be worth what the project wants. However, I think the results are pretty cool. There's no way you're going to get that delayed effect otherwise, and I think it adds a lot of realism to that impact. So, one last thing I'll say about that is, if we go down here to this time shift, this is really handy for just fine-tuning the spikes and when that comes in compared to the main plume explosion. So that goes for a few frames, and then I decided to have it delay a little bit before it shows up on the scene. And so it's up to you how you want to dial that in, but it is nice to use a time shift towards the very end to dictate that. And this switch right here is just making sure that nothing shows up before frame 30. Anyway, that all happens like so. That about does it for the spikes for right now. And in the next video, I want to move on to debris, shockwaves, and other layers.